So we are in Galatians, and just kind of a refresher of why Galatians, why are we studying this, and I'm giving you again my personal opinion on this. I think the church has misunderstood Paul. I think we have misunderstood Paul's relationship to Judaism, and that we misunderstood how Paul often uses the Jewish scriptures, which for him is the Septuagint, the Greek version. And I think Galatians is a good place for us to begin to challenge and examine those assumptions and perhaps look at Paul with a new perspective or some fresh eyes. And just by way, it's been a couple of weeks since we've been in here because of other events. But we looked last week at how Paul begins his argument or centers it in his apostolic authority, that was given to him by God, that Paul does not answer to the church in Antioch or the church in Jerusalem, which is, Paul, as we've looked at the last couple of lessons, seems to have had a break, a split with both Antioch and Jerusalem after the Jerusalem Council, that we've looked at how that seems to play out and how we match up Acts with Galatians. And that Paul sees the gospel as what we call an apocalyptic event, which for him means that God has invaded this present evil age, as it was viewed in the apocalyptic worldview, with new creation. And that came through God resurrecting Jesus Christ from the dead. And that because Jesus is the firstborn, the first of new creation, that is the hope that all who follow God, who are servants of God, expect. Okay? So, today we're going to look at verses 6 through 10, as we're sort of exegeting our way through the book, and looking at what I've decided to call, for lack of a better term, the rebuke. And what we need to do is kind of remember what makes this letter a bit unique when we compare it with Paul's other letters. So we looked last time at the greeting form, of a letter, where we looked at how Paul says, typically it's from, and it's either Paul or Paul and some other people, oftentimes with a descriptor about, who this is or who they are. A letter that is to, so who is this being written to? The addressees. And then the greeting, grace and peace, which is the combination of two greetings. First being the Greek greeting that was traditional in a Greek letter, which is charis, or grace. And the Jewish greeting, which is shalom, or peace. And we talked about how peace is not in the Jewish sense of shalom. It is not the absence of violence. It is something much greater, more significant. It is everything working as it should work. Wholeness, completeness, perfection. Lack of violence, lack of war is a teeny tiny sliver of shalom. In fact, even in modern Hebrew, if you're greeting someone when you want to say, "How are you?" to a man, you would say "Ma shlomech," which is literally, "How is your peace?" To a woman, it'd be "Ma shlomcha," but it is this: "How is your well-being? How is your sense of wholeness?" That is shalom. So, now we're going to look at what follows that greeting. And if we look at Paul's other letters, here is the way we see it. This is 1 Thessalonians. After giving that greeting, the traditional greeting, Paul says, and this is probably Paul's first letter that he writes, he says, "We always give thanks to God for all of you, and mention you in our prayers constantly, remembering before our God and Father your work of faith and labor of love and steadfastness of hope in our Lord Jesus Christ." Then 2 Thessalonians, it says, we must always give thanks to God for you, brothers and sisters, as is right, because your faith is growing abundantly, and the love of every one of you for one another is increasing. Therefore, we ourselves boast of you among the churches of God for your steadfastness and faith during all your persecutions and the afflictions that you are enduring. If we look at another Paul letter, in 1 Corinthians, he begins that. He then follows the greeting at the beginning with, I give thanks to my God always for you because of the grace of God that has been given to you in Christ Jesus. And in 2 Corinthians, he follows that introduction with, blessed be the God of our Father, of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all consolation, who consoles us in all afflictions, so that we may be able to console those who are in any affliction with the consolation with which we ourselves are consoled by God. If we look at Philippians, it says, I thank my God every time I remember you, constantly praying with joy in every one of my prayers for all of you, because of your sharing in the gospel from the first day until now. Philemon, he says, when I remember you in my prayers, I always thank God because I hear of your love for all the saints and your faith toward the Lord Jesus. And finally in Romans, he says, first I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is proclaimed throughout the world. For God, whom I serve with my spirit, by announcing the gospel of his Son, is my witness that without ceasing I remember you always in my prayers, asking that by God's will I may somehow at least succeed in coming to you. At last succeed in coming to you. So, my question is, what do you notice in all these letters? Paul gives his introduction, which we looked at in the last class, who this is to and from and to, and grace and peace, and then he has these statements. What do you see in all of these?
Congratulations that you're following in the path, at least to some extent.
Okay, so there's a positive
of that.
You're doing a good job. Okay, what else do you notice?
He's always thankful.
He's always thankful. Okay. What else do you notice? He mentions them in prayer. Okay. I'm in prayer constantly for you. Paul's got a pretty long prayer list. If you take all these letters kind of as a whole, all right? What else do you notice?
So he says that he remembers each other.
Okay, he remembers them. Good. Anything else? Yeah, so let's look at that. So we've talked about the traditional form being this, that we described earlier, the from, the to, and this greeting of grace and peace. And then he gives sort of this thanksgiving and prayer for the addressees. Okay, I'm thankful to God for you and for the great work that you are doing and how you've held steadfast and blah, 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 blah. But it's all very positive, building you up. Okay, and I should note that if we look at other traditional non-Christian letters, this sort of form is not uncommon. Okay, Paul's not inventing a new style here. He's using how people traditionally write letters, okay, in this sort of Greco-Roman world. And so he's kind of building them up. And what's interesting is, given what we know about Paul's other letters, would you classify that Paul's other letters in general are just all rainbows and unicorns throughout the whole letter when he talks about them? No. So even though he's going to hit them with some hard stuff in a lot of these churches, he begins with this very positive sort of build them up statement. Okay? I'm sure there's a management theory in there somewhere, right? But he builds them up before he hits them with, okay, here's the thing you need to correct, or here's the problem you've got. Okay? Well, let's look at what he does in the letter to Galatia. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another gospel, but there are some who are confusing you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should proclaim to you a gospel contrary to what we proclaim to you, let that one be accursed. As we have said before, so now I repeat, if anyone proclaims to you a gospel contrary to what you received, let that one be accursed. Am I now seeking human approval or God's approval? Am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. What's different?
Attitude.
Things a little upset.
Just a little upset. If people didn't get from the way he began the letter that he was a little upset, the people in the back learned on this one he's really upset. Okay? Because he just literally just smacks them across the face. Right out the chute. Yeah, this is shocking. This is unusual. This is unique among Paul's letters. Okay? And again, this is not Paul's first letter, so we can't make the argument that Paul learned his lesson and he made his future letters nicer. At least 1 Thessalonians came before this letter. Okay? And already we see Paul's formula of thanking God for them as being sort of established there. And so here he hits them with this I got nothing nice to say about you right now. I'm just going to lay it out there. Okay? Y'all are being stupid. And he just smacks them right up front. So I want to look at a few things that I see in this letter, and it's not just me, it's commentators that have also seen it, that I think helps kind of set the stage for what's going to happen in the rest of this letter, and also help us understand a bit more about how Paul is viewing the gospel as he understands it and how it's being perverted. And there's a question that we have not really delved into very much yet, that every week I keep thinking now's the right time to do it, and then I think, no, we need to go a little further before we dive into this, and that is, who are Paul's opponents? Okay? Who are these people and what are they saying? And we begin to get some clues here about what they're saying, but who they are is something that I think it'll be better if we talk about a little bit later. But the first thing I want us to look at today is this word. Okay? He says, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel, not that there is another gospel. So that word deserting is, in Greek, it's a word called metatithemi. And if we look at Paul's letters, Paul's vocabulary is recognizable. Okay, there are words Paul seems to use a lot. And then there are words Paul doesn't use very much at all. This is one of those words Paul really doesn't use very much. And it's not used very much in the New Testament as a whole. But it has the sense of to change one's mind or to desert. And in particular, if we look outside of the New Testament, this word, the noun form of this word, describes a person who belongs to one philosophical school, who then decides to abandon that school and go to another school. So imagine, Greek philosophy schools, perhaps you've got someone who's a Stoic. Okay, we're not going to get into what Stoics are, but they were a Stoic, and they said, I'm no longer a Stoic. I am now a Epicurean, okay, or something, right? They've changed their philosophical school. Maybe in modern parlance, you might say, I am a vegan, right? Well, now I am a pescatarian, okay? I eat fish now, okay? It's that sort of change of philosophy from one sort of thing to another. That word has sort of as its background. And I think that there are some possible allusions that may come up in someone's mind that was well versed in the Hebrew Scriptures when they see that sort of a word. And one of it seems to come from Mount Sinai. In a couple of places we see in Exodus, Exodus 32, we see the Lord said to Moses, this is after Moses has been receiving the Ten Commandments, and he's up there a long time, like 40 days long, and the Israelites are kind of getting impatient, and after 40 days they decide to build some calves and worship them. And it says, go down at once. The people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have acted perversely. They have been quick to turn aside from the way that I commanded them. They have cast for themselves an image of a calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought us up out of the land of Egypt. Two words I would note there. There's this sense of they have changed. Okay, they have turned aside from. And also, he says that they have acted perversely. Okay? And then we see in Deuteronomy, where in Moses' sort of farewell speech, he summarizes that act again. He says, then I saw that you had indeed sinned against the Lord your God by casting for yourselves an image of a calf. You had been quick to turn from the way that the Lord had commanded you. Okay? Again, here we get the word quickly that shows up, as well as this idea of turning away from God. Well, there's another, I need to point out that in the Septuagint, the Greek version, it does not use that Greek word in either of these verses to describe that turning away. But it does use it in another book that's part of the Septuagint. It's not part of our modern Bibles, but it's the book of 2 Maccabees, which is in the Septuagint. And here it's talking about the period when the Greeks are in control of the land, and specifically, if you'll recall, after Alexander dies, the entire Greek world gets divided by his 4 generals. And initially, Ptolemy has control of Israel, and then later the Seleucus and his descendants take over the land. And Antiochus is one of the Seleucid emperors who is trying to turn the temple into a pagan temple. And Antiochus felt that he was being treated with contempt, and he was suspicious of her reproachful tone. The youngest brother, being still alive, this is dealing with the ruling family in Jerusalem. Being still alive, Antiochus not only appealed to him in words, but promised with oaths that he would make him rich and enviable if he would turn from the ways of his ancestors, and that he would take him for his friend and entrust him with public affairs. Okay? So in other words, what Antiochus is doing in the larger context here is he's trying to win the favor of a local ruler to give him control of doing all the things that he wants. And he says, I want him to turn from the ways of his ancestors. And that word turn from is metatithemi. Okay? It's that same Greek word. And we also see a similar sentiment a few chapters later in 2 Maccabees when it says, we have heard that the Jews do not consent to our fathers' change to Greek customs, but prefer their own way of living and ask that their own customs be allowed. So in both these verses, what we're looking at is people that are turning away from the traditions of their ancestors, using this word metatithemi. So do you see a little bit of the potential irony here in 2 Maccabees using this verse to say, here are Jews who are turning away from Jewish traditions to go to Greek ways of living, okay, abandoning Jewish, probably food laws and things like that, to adopt more a Greco-Roman, or in this case a Greek style. And yet what Paul is dealing with is Gentiles who are being encouraged to turn away from non-Jewish life to become Jews. So he flips the meaning of the word, or the sense of the word, as it has been used in Jewish history. Does that make sense? Okay. So there's some irony here that I think they might have picked up on, given that they probably knew the stories of 2 Maccabees better than we do. Okay, something else about this word that I think is important is Paul uses present tense. You are deserting. It is not a completed action. And this is again, I'm not going to give you a big Greek lesson, but in both Hebrew and Greek, in the ancient versions, there's no such thing as present tense or past tense. You have uncompleted action and completed action. Okay? That's how they describe the world. And so in this case, it's an uncompleted action. Okay? It's not been completed. And so by that, I think Paul says, or what he's implying is, they have begun this process of deserting, but they have not fully deserted yet. Okay? In other words, the game's not over, right? It's an ongoing action that he's trying to reverse. Okay? And I think that's an important thing to remember, that he's not going back and trying to say, you have deserted the one that called you, but you are in the process of deserting if you don't change the way you're acting. Okay? I think it's a very important thing for us to think about. And also, he goes on to say, the one who called you in the grace of Christ. So my question is, who is the one that Paul is referring to? Okay. Anybody else have a thought?
Could be referring to either God calling him to that. Could be referring to God calling him to the grace of Christ.
Okay. I'll tell you what, after a long time, I've read this as being, Paul was saying, you've deserted me. But I don't think that, now that I've studied it a little more carefully, and how he uses the phrase the one in this letter and other places, the one is God. It's not that they've deserted Paul. In Paul's view, they are abandoning God. Okay? It's God that called them in the grace of Christ. God calls them. And in Paul's view, the actions they're taking are leading them down the path to abandon God. And that is because God is the source, and I would argue the force, in salvation. In other words, Christ is the main expression and facilitator of God's call. Okay? And this gets to what we talked about earlier in the lesson, that for Paul, the focus of the Gospels is God, not Jesus. It's what God has done through Jesus, okay, for humanity. And that by saying you're deserting the one who called you in the grace of Christ is a way for him to say you're abandoning God and how you've been called into this new creation. Then I want to look at this curse. There's a lot here. There's a whole lot here we could talk about. But there's a few things that I think are kind of important that maybe there's more there than meets the eye that we haven't always thought about. And that is, why in the world does Paul mention an angel from heaven? Okay, he says, but even if we or an angel from heaven should proclaim to you a gospel contrary to what we proclaim to you, let that one be accursed. Why bring angels into this?
Well, that kind of where sin came from. An angel from heaven came down and, convinced Eve to disobey God.
Oh, okay. Let's unpack that a little bit. Where in Genesis does it tell us that it was Satan that tempted Eve? I may be stealing Wade's thunder for a couple of weeks.
met with an angel. There are several people who met with angels and came down to give them God's word.
Okay, okay,
So they had in their background.
okay, okay. Here's what's interesting in Genesis. It's just a serpent. It's a talking serpent.
I know, but we know it's Enoch.
Hmm?
I know, but we know it's Enoch.
Oh, okay. So what's funny is that is a very much a later development than Genesis. In Genesis, it's a talking snake. And Jewish rabbis have a field day in the Second Temple period trying to figure out why it is that the serpent wants to tempt Eve. And what they don't do is equate it with Satan. But it's interesting that you've hit on an important point, and I'm going to argue that this is part of Paul in general. If you read his letters, Paul has a pretty dim view of angels. Okay, he doesn't think much of angels, but in later traditions, it is angels that bring evil into the world, that teach humans how to do magic, dark arts, warfare, cosmetics. All these things are considered evils that the angels, these fallen angels, teach them. Okay? And that gets to this idea of apocalyptic worldview that Paul has. Because in apocalyptic literature, angels play a really important role in apocalyptic literature. One of the things that they do is they are guides through these visions. Okay? If you look at the book of Daniel or you look at the book of Zechariah, the first 8 chapters or so in Zechariah has four visions, and he has an angel guide that leads him along on these visions and shows him these things. Ezekiel has an angel guide that he's taken up in the spirit and he is shown things. Daniel has an angel guide that takes him around and shows him things. And so they guide them through these apocalyptic visions. But it's always in apocalyptic literature, and this is different than prophetic literature. In apocalyptic literature, the person that gets the vision has no clue what it means. Right? They're like, what in the world? I don't know what this means. What is it? And it's this angel that interprets the vision for them. That says, here is what this means, and then lays out all these things that it means. You see that in Daniel, you see it in Zechariah, you see it some in Ezekiel, is kind of a beginning of this apocalyptic stuff. We see it in the book of Revelation, even. Okay? The angel describing to John of the Apocalypse what this means. And angels are also a sign of heavenly approval. That this message that they're given and its interpretation has the sanction of heaven. And so we've already seen at the beginning of Paul's letter, when he talks about this present evil age, is an apocalyptic description, that this is, again, I think part of Paul's apocalyptic worldview of how he sees angels functioning. Well, then we also see in the book of Revelation, it says in chapter 14, then I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven with an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation and tribe and language and people. He said in a loud voice, fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the springs of water. So in Revelation, what does this angel do?
It's God's will.
Okay, specifically, what word does he use? Gospel. So at least in Revelation, there's a view that we see of an angel being a being that helps proclaim the gospel to the nations. And whenever we see the nations, it means people that aren't Jews. Okay? To the rest of the world. All right? So we see their apocalyptic function. We see how they function in Revelation, which is also an apocalyptic book. And we also see in Acts This is in Stephen's speech before he gets killed, before he gets stoned, where he's accusing the Jews of basically not following the law and ignoring every time God told them to do something. And it says, "It was this Moses whom they rejected when they said, 'Who made you a ruler and judge?' And whom God now sent as both ruler and liberator through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He led them out, having performed wonders and signs in Egypt, at the Red Sea, and in the wilderness for 40 years. This is the Moses who said to the Israelites, 'God will raise up a prophet for you from your own people as he raised me up.' He is the one who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him at Mount Sinai and with our ancestors, and he received living oracles to give us. You are the ones that received the law as ordained by angels, and yet you have not kept it." How does Stephen view angels? What are they doing?
They're the proxies for God. They're the proxies for God.
Ah, where are they the proxies for God?
When Moses was in the bush, I've always thought that was God there that said, "Take off your shoes, you're in the presence of God."
If you read Exodus, there ain't no angels in Exodus doing this.
And Sinai, who it was that was there, with God. Moses was God.
In later Jewish interpretations of Second Temple period, God doesn't speak directly to people. It's done through angels. It's an angel in the burning bush. It's an angel that gives Moses the Torah at Mount Sinai. Okay? It's angels that validate that this is what's from God. You don't see it in Exodus. You don't see it in Deuteronomy. You see it in the later writings. But in Paul's world, this is what angels do. And Josephus even confirms this in his book, Antiquities or Histories of the Jews. In one particular passage, it says, "And for ourselves we have learned from God the most excellent of our doctrines and the most holy part of our law by angels or ambassadors. For this name brings God to the knowledge of mankind and is sufficient to reconcile enemies to one another." Josephus considers the law was delivered by angels.
What changed them? What made them go from thinking it was...
Oh, that's a good question.
Correct.
So part of what happens is you get this rise of thought after they get back from exile that God is the God of the universe. Okay? In other words, not only is it just that, okay, here's God, and there's all these other gods, and you're supposed to worship this God, quit worshiping these other gods, which is what we see throughout most of the Old Testament. What you see after they come back from exile is they're saying, these other gods aren't even really gods. Okay? They're not there. God is the God of the universe, which raises some big questions. Okay? Well, if God is the God of the universe, how does he manage all the affairs of the universe? The universe is a big place. Okay? And they say, well, God's kind of up here, and he lets angels do it. Okay? You also have the problem of evil. If there's only one God, why is there still suffering and evil in the world? Why do the righteous die? Okay? And again, a lot of that they attribute some of the bad things that happen to fallen angels. Okay? So there's this change of thought that happens over time that angels are playing this administrative role on behalf of God.
Change the org chart.
Yeah, the org chart shifts a bit. Okay? Yeah. And let's be honest, our thought evolves too, right? The way we understand and interpret Scripture based on other information changes all the time. And this is just one of those ways we see in the Bible how that view changes. But it's clear from the New Testament, from Josephus, and from other Jewish writings of the Second Temple period, that they held that angels were responsible for giving the law of Moses. So, why angels? Why is it that Paul has to include them in this list? Outside of just being a big hyperbole, right, of saying anybody that says anything different, okay, Why is it that he makes it important that angels are in this list?
Perhaps his opponents say that they received something from an angel.
Okay, that's a definite possibility. That his opponents are saying, angels, this has been revealed to us through angels. Okay, that's quite possible. That's quite possible. What other reasons might there be?
He's letting people know that who called them was the ultimate. Angels are much lower than the ultimate. And anybody that changes your mind, there's nobody above God. And God's the one who called you. It doesn't make any difference what anybody else said. God is the creator, as we did this morning.
Yep.
And everybody else is below the line.
That's a good way to put it. Cam, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, maybe by referring to angels, it gives whoever is delivering that message more credibility. It's something more credible than if it came from a person.
Yes.
From an angel's idea of credibility.
Okay, James?
I think we need to remember that angels are just messengers. They have no authority.
Yeah. But they're a messenger from, typically from God. So he's like basically saying, look, what you've received from me, the call that came from God has been revealed to you by God. There ain't no heavenly messenger that's going to change it. Right? Yes, sir.
Having lived in Utah for a few years and hearing from some of the LDS friends that we made about their revelation and how that came from an angel, and to me, I always thought of Galatians chapter 1.
Yeah.
And almost in a prophetic sense that, it may be happening now and it may be happening at some future point. I don't care if it's an angel that gives you a new gospel.
Yeah.
Let
So
it be a Christian.
that's a good point. And so what Paul hasn't mentioned yet here, but he will mention it later in the letter, almost in passing. What is the sign that Paul is going to identify as the sign that the message that you have, that you received, that you accepted has come from God? Anyone know? It's the Spirit. So you've received what he says later. I've got one question. But did you receive the Spirit because of what you believed, okay, or what you did? Okay. So for him, the sign is the reception of the Spirit. Okay. It is not in some angelic interpretation. So the next thing we're looking at is this curse. Let that one be accursed. There's an Old Testament context to this word that is perhaps gives some sense of the strength of it. That word is cherub. Okay, that's the so cherub, and it means literally devoted to destruction. When God says, because of what those Amalekites did, kill them all, kill all the cattle, kill everything around them, the word used is cherub. Let them be devoted to destruction. They're mine, and I choose for you to just burn them all up. Okay? It is the most serious of punishments. Is cherub. It's devoted to God through destruction. Okay? So my question is, how would we put this in modern English vernacular? I'm going to call it a critique. One of my challenges with sometimes why we translate passages in the Bible is we sort of tame them a bit from the sense that sometimes is there. How would you give this a modern English equivalent?
Nuke 'em.
Mm-hmm.
Nuke 'em.
go to hell.
Yeah.
That's the one I come up with. If anyone, even an angel from heaven, should proclaim to you a gospel contrary to what we proclaim to you, tell him to go to hell. That's effectively what he says. There might be another word he would use in more modern vernacular that begins with an F, that kind of gets the same sentiment across in terms of strength. Okay? This is serious business. Serious business. And Paul's not mincing words. Okay? He's laying it on the line and saying this is what the situation is. Okay. And then he gives his concluding statement, and I'll just say there's a debate about whether this statement goes with this paragraph or with what comes after it. And scholars are debated about half and half. I think it goes with here. Primarily because I think what he's saying is, after what he's just said, and using some pretty offensive language, he basically says, now, am I trying to get human approval or God's approval? Or am I trying to please people? And he says, I wouldn't be doing that if it weren't for, if I were a slave of Christ. And so I think that's why it belongs with the earlier statement. And this gives us a clue into perhaps what Paul is being told, these opponents of Paul are saying, is that what Paul gave to you was a diluted gospel. He was trying to get you to convert because circumcision, we know circumcision has been offensive to Greeks for a long, long time. Therefore, Paul just kind of removed it. Hey, you don't need to do that. It's okay. You can become fully part of God without doing all those things that Jews have to do. Just go ahead. So in other words, Paul's diluting the gospel, or they might have been saying that Paul's trying to convince God, look at these Gentiles, what they're willing to do, without having all this baggage, come in and do this. I'm less concerned with that as I do think he's saying, what they're saying is Paul gave you a diluted gospel. He didn't give you the real gospel. And now we're telling you the real gospel, and it means you've got to become a Jew, basically. Okay? So, in summary, we see Paul making an abrupt shift in this letter that demonstrates the seriousness of the issue. It's a total break from the way he traditionally writes his letters. He views what's happening in Galatia as not a done deal, but as an ongoing process that he's trying to reverse before it comes to some larger conclusion. And his rebuke that he gives them is loaded with allusions to the Greek Old Testament and Second Temple Jewish thought. And these allusions often subvert the conditional usage of these terms in other contexts. So he kind of reverses what we see in these passages, how they use them at other times. And that by following this gospel, the Galatians are not abandoning Paul, they're abandoning God. And that's the argument he sets up. Okay? So next week, we're going to look at how he begins his defense of himself. And so we're going to look at a larger section. We're not going to cover this full section. We're going to do it in a few chunks. But it's important to kind of read the whole thing, which is Galatians 1:11 through 2:21. And one interesting thing is when you look at the place where Paul confronts Peter, ask yourself, where in the world does Paul's speech to Peter end? And if you read it, maybe you'll see what happens if it doesn't end with one sentence. What happens if it continues on a little further? We'll look at that. And then also read Acts 9-11 if you'd like, to kind of get a context of the background. And what I do, as I've said in past weeks, I try to listen to it on Audible. It's 19 minutes and 35 seconds on Audible, and it's an easy listen. And when you hear it, you hear things that you don't necessarily get when you read it, and you also get to do it in one big chunk, so you get the entire context of what Paul's saying. So I'd encourage you to try to do that. Thank you all very much for your comments, participation, and we'll see you next time.